Good evening, welcome. My name is Nicola Longford. I'm the Executive Director here at the Sixth Floor Museum, and welcome to a truly exceptional program format and theme tonight. This is an event that has been inspired and led by presiding judge of Dallas County's Criminal District Courts, Judge Brandon Birmingham, and it is because of Judge Birmingham's own personal interest in the fascinating trial proceedings of Jack Ruby, along with the judge's infectious enthusiasm, generosity, and spirit, that has forged the development of this unique and rewarding partnership. Tonight's program, collaboration between Dallas County's legal arm, featuring Judge Brandon Birmingham, and criminal defense attorney Toby Shook and the Sixth Floor Museum, is thus an inspiring and incredibly exciting positive outcome after more than 9 years of on and off discussions since 2008 about the fate of the large cache of historical records and artifacts pertaining to the trial of Jack Ruby, and that were part of the legendary Dallas County District Attorney Henry Wade's records that sat forgotten for many decades in a Dallas County safe. So this year, in the spring of 2017, and with extreme thanks to Judge Birmingham, who was the lead, if not the sole custodian and steward, navigating this latest opportunity for a loan agreement between Dallas County and the Sixth Floor Museum, that all the records that were part of the District Attorney Henry Wade's Jack Ruby materials, they have come to the Sixth Floor Museum for preservation, digitization, and preparation for public access. And that's over 20 linear feet of fascinating stuff. This significant body of historical materials, including some quite strange artifacts like knuckle busters, a gun holster, Ruby's personal address book, and other effects, greatly enhance the existing set of Ruby-related materials currently in the museum's collections. They all shed light on the complex makeup of a character so many still today seek to understand who he was, why he felt compelled in a split second to shoot on live television the alleged murderer of the President of the United States. This new loan from the Dallas County DA's office, in conjunction with existing museum Jack Ruby collections of photographs, records, artifacts, and other materials, now creates the most extensive assembly of Jack Ruby-related materials anywhere, and which we hold at the Sixth Floor Museum in public trust. It is the Sixth Floor Museum's commitment to make these materials accessible for researchers in the museum's reading room, through online collections, and our special module called e-museum through our website, and also through various types of educational and public programming. Many of you in the audience tonight may not have been to the Sixth Floor Museum before. For those of you who are taking the CLE credits, you may not know anything about this rich history, but we are thrilled to be hosting you here. And maybe we'll provoke your curiosity in discovering different aspects of historic preservation beyond examination of traditional legal proceedings and documentation, dovetailing our respective methods, museum methods and legal methods, and historical analysis on collecting information, stories, and testimonials, preserving evidence, artifacts, etc. It demonstrates why, even after all these years, professional collaborations such as the one we have tonight only help strengthen our collective work to better understand our past, reaffirming why understanding our history is always relevant in some way to the now, and will help guide us as we make way for the future and what will come after us. With current renovations underway at the former Dallas Police Headquarters, soon to be the new UNT Law School, and to the Dallas County Criminal Courts and Records Building, in several years there will be new interpretive spaces inside these historic structures that will relate the events of Lee Harvey Oswald's arrest, his interrogation and the shooting, and the Jack Ruby timeline events that fall within the JFK assassination story. And so the Sixth Floor Museum stands at the ready to provide support and assistance to our satellite historic sites by offering our collections, our film footage, photographs, records, over 55,000 items we have in our collections. And it's just wonderful. But we will work collectively to integrate a new form of shared history storytelling that will aid the public and also our local community about what happened, the when, the where, the why, the how, the who, the what. And I can safely speak for all of our staff here. Everybody here at the museum has helped for several months to try and put this event together, and they've all been absolutely fabulous. And it's so rewarding. We really have such an exciting job to work with all of you. And I'd like to acknowledge now the living legends here tonight, to whom we're eternally grateful for your support and willingness to share your stories and to help educate those that will come after us. There are so very many friends in the audience tonight to thank and recognize. But first, I'd like to thank, aside from the staff, our board members. And Linda Lynn Adams, who, as some of you might know, is a Dallas legend in her own. Thanks to her, there's so many historic sites that have been preserved. And she regrettably cannot be here tonight, but I wanted her to be recognized. Way back 29 years ago almost, she couldn't imagine that we would still be around telling this story. I'd like to recognize Lynn Novak, Keith Pomacol, and Tino Halomo from our board. And our historical living historians, history. Walton and Catherine Bondis, Phil Bullison Jr., who's representing his father, Helen Holmes, the widow of Bert Holmes, Bob Huffaker and Viva, his wife, Detective Jim Lavelle, Paul McGarren, Nancy Myers, I think was supposed to be here tonight. I'm not sure if she's arrived, and Wayman and David Rose. And there are also many other descendants and family members recognizing some historical figures who are now deceased. But I'd like to recognize Margaret and Jeff Hirschman, Julian Skip Alexander, Helen Holmes, who's the widow of Bert Holmes, Shirley Baskus-Lobel, and her friends that she brought from Bill Alexander's family. And, of course, Kim Wade and his family that he brought here tonight. Thank you so much. Rachel Wade Robertson, who's family of the DA, Prosecutor Henry Wade, and Karen Wise, who's the daughter of Ruby Wise. If you can stand up or wave or let us, the audience, know who you are, thank you so much for being here. And also, I would like to thank the District Attorney, Faith Johnson, and her staff, her Public Information Officer, Elizabeth Saab, and all the other people that helped make this event tonight. But now, without further ado, I'm going to please help me give a warm welcome to our presenters, Toby Shook and Judge Brandon Birmingham.
There's Mrs. Kennedy, and the crowd yells, "And the President of the United States." And I can see his suntan all the way from here. And here they come, right down toward us. I can see Mrs. Kennedy, and they're going to come right on down and shake hands with everybody. Mrs. Kennedy gave a lovely smile and a wave at that time. The people surging up toward that fence, and the President waves goodbye, and back they go to the car.
That is quite a fancy automobile, let me tell you, that presidential limousine. The President now in with the First Lady, and the motorcade begins to move out. The President and the First Lady sitting in the back seat. As we said, the top is down. Immediately following the presidential limousine, a car loaded with Secret Service men.
Now they are waving, and here comes Jackie waving by, and Mr. Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy radiant in that pink outfit and the pink hat, and of course you can hear the streets around us. They're driving at about 5 miles an hour, plenty slow enough for the people on hand here to get a good look at them, to get a good wave in, and I'm sure that everybody in my immediate vicinity would swear they were waving directly at them.
It was a wonderful welcome for President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy. There was certainly no adverse demonstration. It was a tremendous welcome that Big D gave our chief executive.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You'll excuse the fact that I'm out of breath, but about 10 or 15 minutes ago, a tragic thing from all indications at this point has happened in the city of Dallas.
The police are now surrounding the area down here. Sirens are screaming, and evidently police believe that the man who fired the shots is still in the Texas School Book Depository building at the corner of Elm and Houston in downtown Dallas.
What was a wonderful welcome in downtown Dallas has become a scene of indescribable horror.
The president's car was some 50 feet still yet. In front of us coming towards us, and we heard the first shot, and the president, I don't know who was hit first, but the president jumped up in his seat.
I saw the blood, and I had the baby, and I just ran, and I got on top of him and laid on the grass.
President Kennedy is on the inside of Parkland Hospital, and 2 priests have just been sent in to the room with the president.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
You can see the telescopic sight.
That's Homicide Captain Will Fritz examining the weapon.
You can imagine the confusion that's going on in the city of Dallas today, not only in our newsroom, but in all the newsrooms. Ron, tell us what you know.
We joined a police motorcade that was dashing to the Texas Theater where they had a report of a man coming in there that was armed. Police suddenly jumped this man and started to drag him out of the theater, hustled him out to the car as the crowd broke and started to maul the police officers and grab this man, trying to run with him. They shouted murder and just almost anything to try and get at this man. As you see here, the officers hustled him into the car and ran away just as fast as they could from this Texas Theater in hopes of protecting this man, and they have taken him off to an unknown spot. We don't know where they're holding him.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You have been.
Nobody said what? Sir?
You have been.
Nobody said what? Okay, we can't hear you. Okay.
What did you do in Russia?
He's been charged with both killing Officer Tippin and John F. Kennedy. I figure we have sufficient evidence to convict him.
Is there any doubt in your mind, Chief, that Oswald is the man who killed the president?
I think this is the man that killed the president.
It is anticipated that he will be moved because extreme precautions have been taken. They are ready to prevent anything they possibly can. There are perhaps 200 or 300 people outside the City Hall waiting to see the transfer of Oswald.
This is the basement floor of the Dallas City Hall, and that's a scuffle on the basement floor. It seems to concern photographers.
He has been shot. Oswald has been shot.
Lee Oswald.
All right, how's everybody doing tonight? Good. That was some good video work by the Sixth Floor Museum, kind of encapsulate everything that happened in that fateful weekend back in November of 1963. I wanted to tell you all just a little bit about how we even got here and then tell you where we're going to go tonight. First of all, my name is Brandon Birmingham. I was a prosecutor for some time with the Dallas County DA's office, and I used to work in the cold case unit. And there in the warehouse at the DA's office in the corner was a file that we were never allowed to touch, the file of Jack Ruby. And so I was always very curious about how that was, what was in there, and what type of paperwork, and how there was just this mystique about it. And so Mr. Shook and I got together, and we were talking about the biggest trials in the history of Texas, and he's been involved with some of them. But then if you go back, I would say that this is the biggest trial that happened certainly in the state of Texas, and probably one of the biggest trials in the history of this country. And it happened right here, and we had access to the file. So we arranged to have it donated here, and tonight has been a long time coming with a lot of people who've done a lot of work. So I'm very, very proud to be here tonight with my good friend, Mr. Toby Shook. The state of Texas versus Jack Rubenstein. That is how he was indicted. It was a capital murder trial. The state was seeking the death penalty. There was an alias on the indictment of Jack Ruby, but his true name was Jack Rubenstein. That's how he was indicted. There is a roadmap that you'll see there. There was 2 bail hearings. There was a change of venue hearing. That was fascinating. Then we have jury selection, and then we do indeed have the actual trial of the century, and that is how we're going to go forward tonight. So I want to thank each and every one of you for coming. It's an honor really to stand in front of you all and to actually stand in front of some of the people who lived this trial or did the investigation on the case or were involved somehow in the investigation of the assassination not only of the president, but also of Officer Tippit. So, welcome. Let's talk very, very first about the first time. What you're seeing here is one of the very first times that the name of the defendant was released to the public.
Oswald expired at 1:07 p.m. The man who shot him has been arrested and will be charged with murder.
Who is he? What's his name? That's all we need to.
The man's name is Jack Ruby. He goes by the name of Jack Ruby. He's a local Dallas man. His real name is Rubenstein.
Just let us out, please.
Did he give us a motive, Chief? How did he get inside the building? Nothing on a motive?
I have no other statements to make at this time.
That's Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry announcing the name of Jack Rubenstein. So who is Jack Ruby? He was born in Chicago. He was the fifth of 10 children, grew up in a very, very tough neighborhood, a poor neighborhood in Chicago. Skipped out of school, was a gambler, a hustler. They called him Sparky.
Sparky.
You know why they call him Sparky?
Because he could always get things done.
He could always get things done. So he floated around for some time. After he got out of school, he was drafted and served in the U.S. Army, served in World War II, was honorably discharged, and after some time actually moved here to Dallas in about 1947, shortened his name to Ruby, and he ran some of the nightclubs. I'd like to, first of all, tell you that you are all now members officially of the Carousel Club. I don't know that it's going to be as exciting as it possibly could have been back in '63. Toby and I are going to try to be entertaining. I don't know if we can provide the same services that they did.
We thought about getting a snare drum and maybe a sax player, kind of interludes, but thought it might be too much.
But it was the first club he had was called the Sovereign Club, and that was a dinner club. And these were in vogue, obviously, back at the time. Then he opens up the Carousel Club. I've had the pleasure of meeting along the way. Tammy True was her name, and spoken with her a little bit about her experiences there. She's still alive. I was so hoping to see her tonight. She's got a larger-than-life personality, which is one of the great things about this case. But she told me, she was very quick to point out that she was a burlesque dancer. She was not a stripper. She told me to get my mind right, that it was not a strip club like we know today, but it was very tasteful. It was an entertainment club. They'd have live bands there, comedians, ventriloquists, and they would, of course, have the burlesque dancers. And that was what the Carousel Club was back in 1964. Ruby was known to try to promote things the old-fashioned way. If you all have looked at some of the vitrines, I'm going to try to refer to some of the things that you all have seen. Well, first of all, a vitrine is the glass thing back there with all the stuff in it, okay? I didn't know that until doing this whole thing. But the vitrine is back there, and he would pass out these cards. There was one in particular, a card of Jada. That was actually recovered from Ruby's car after he was arrested for the murder in the case and the trial that we're all here to talk about, and it's right back there. But he'd pass those cards out. There would be guests, including men and women. There'd be lawyers there. The police were more than welcome there. Jim Lavelle, who is, boy, it's an honor to have you here. That was his beat. He knew Jack Ruby. He told me in an interview that we did, and told me that he was an honest businessman and that he ran his club very well and very lawfully. And so that was who Jack Ruby was in 1964.
Jack Ruby, and what you'll find as we go through this, was very much alive. And Dallas was a very different city back at that time. Kind of what it's coming now. Downtown has been revived, but back in that time, downtown was the center of everything. And within this 12-block radius, all your banking was done, all your office. It was lively. You had all your restaurants and nightclubs. So he was seen on the streets every day. If he wasn't in his club, he was out promoting it. And I think what's real interesting when you study this trial, and then you have to go back to the times, is just how different Dallas was, and then the atmosphere of how everything happened just in this area that we're in right now.
All right. So this next clip that we're going to watch, I'm going to show you the clip because it's going to narrow down for you the issue ultimately in the trial. But this was the first time that the public heard about what the actual charge was going to be, and this is what is going to have to be proven by the state at the trial. And we hear now the justice of the peace who is going to read to you what the charge is. So I want you to remember that as we go through the trial, because that's what the lawyers are going to be focusing on as they're going to try to present this evidence.
This is a formal murder complaint filed as of this date, November the 24th, against Jack Ruby. It alleges that on this date, Jack Ruby did voluntarily and with malice aforethought kill Lee Harvey Oswald by shooting him with a gun. This is what is known in Texas as a capital offense. The complaint was filed with me as Justice of the Peace, and no bond is being set as of this time.
All right, so the issue is going to be voluntarily and with malice aforethought. We'll get to that later, but you all heard it was a capital offense. That means it's going to be a death penalty case. And so this is from that night or maybe the next day, but this is very early on in the case. And, of course, the very first thing that has to happen is that the lawyers have to be assembled, okay? And so at the beginning there was a number of lawyers that sort of came in and out, but there was one in particular named Tom Howard.
Tom Howard was Ruby's first lawyer, and things moved a lot quicker back then. You know, President Kennedy was shot on the 22nd, Oswald was shot and killed on the 24th, and Jack Ruby was arrested at that time, and he was indicted on the 26th. So it was a long investigation of 2 days, and I believe Mr. Wade made the decision to seek the death penalty about 5 minutes after the indictment. So there were a number of lawyers that came up to meet Jack Ruby, but when they found out he's going to be held without bail, most of them left except Thomas Howard, who was a very good local criminal lawyer. Howard officed across from the courthouse. Doug Mulder told me an interesting tidbit that his wife was the former wife of Lucky Francaccioni, who she had killed, and Mr. Howard represented and got her off, and then they were able to marry. She was liked the work he had done on the case. He was an interesting guy, but he was smart. Howard quickly developed the defense he thought would work. He wanted to keep this kind of quiet, and as you'll find out, murder with malice is what the state wanted to charge because that could get you the death penalty. His strategy was to try to get the jury to find him guilty of murder without malice, because murder without malice limited your penalty range from 2 to 5 years at the most. And the way he planned to do that was to maybe have Ruby see a couple of local psychiatrists. They could get on the stand and talk about he's kind of a strange guy, got some mental unbalance, but not say he was insane, because Howard thought a jury, particularly a Dallas jury, wouldn't buy off on insanity. It's tough anywhere, but back in 1964 Dallas, it wasn't going to happen, he didn't believe. It's hard to sell to get jurors to let someone walk scot-free for shooting someone down. But he thought it would be more effective to do it that way. They could talk about it, then put friends on. They could talk about his emotional traits and how affected he was by the Kennedy assassination. And then put Jack Ruby on himself. They could talk about personally how he was affected and the pressure he was under, and that when he saw Lee Harvey Oswald walk out, he was overcome by sudden passion. It's the same definition that we use today, that it's a killing done under the immediate influence of sudden passion arising from adequate cause. And that's what he wanted to do, and that's what he set out doing. The problem was the Ruby family, now that this was the biggest story in the world at the time, thought he wasn't a big enough lawyer because he hadn't handled any big cases. Just local cases.
He had a good record, though.
He did. It was he had handled 26 cases in which the state had sought the death penalty, and he won every one of them. So he had a pretty good record. But they told him they didn't think he was comfortable being the lead, so they asked him to find out to find some better lawyers.
So Earl Ruby is Jack's brother, goes to San Francisco to meet with a book publisher. And the book publisher had known this lawyer named Melvin Belli. And they put them in contact. Earl Ruby, as Belli writes in his book, came to one of his murder trials, watched him do a closing argument, and hired him on the spot. So we have the lawyer Melvin Belli. Melvin Belli was a personal injury lawyer from San Francisco. The interesting thing, I think I said this before, these larger-than-life personalities, and Melvin Belli certainly was one. If you were in San Francisco at the time and he had just won a big verdict, you would know because he would fly as Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones flag, and then he would shoot off a cannon off the roof of his building and announce that he had won and that there was a big party to follow. So Melvin Belli had a tremendous amount of personality and charisma and confidence. Let's just say confidence.
Confidence. He had lots of confidence.
And he had a good friend named Joe Tannehill. We'll talk about Joe Tannehill real quick. But first of all, you need to see Melvin Belli. There he is. I don't necessarily mean this picture to be funny. I do want to tell you, though, that picture is going to be a little bit funny by the end of so this is what they call a preview seat. So you look at this picture now. That's a picture from the end of the trial, a legendary moment for Melvin Belli that we'll get into much later. But he was very flamboyant, very confident, very much a sharp dresser. He would have been, I guess, oil and water with what was happening here in Texas. He had the Italian boots, no Stetson hat for him.
No, he wore, obviously, I think his clothes were tailored, came from England. His leather boots were actually English boots, and he liked red linings and all his clothing. And the boots caused a little bit of problem. You'll learn about Bill Alexander, who's one of the prosecutors, and he dubbed those fruit boots in the trial just to get under Belli's skin because Belli was pretty proud of everything. So we heard a lot about fruit boots.
So Melvin Belli's good friend in the personal injury litigation world was a very successful lawyer from Texas named Joe Tannehill. Now, Joe Tannehill was 6'4". He weighed 300 pounds. He was a big country lawyer. He was a graduate of George Washington Law School, worked as an assistant DA in Beaumont, was a U.S. attorney, and then, of course, a very successful plaintiff's lawyer. And was known around there and was Belli's good friend. So you've got Belli with his buddy from Beaumont who are going to come in and try the case. And you've had some interesting conversations with some folks who knew him.
Tannehill had moved to Jasper, Texas, and he had a ranch, which he renamed Sherwood Forest. And he had a lot of confidence, too. But I know the lawyer who actually bought his law office, and he told me that the place is haunted still. That he's working at night, he can smell cigar smoke, he can hear the whiskey cabinet open and things like that. But Tannehill was really interesting. He was a big man, and you can see his eyebrows a little bit, but he liked to grow his eyebrows out and kind of twirl them up because he thought that was intimidating. And he also had big six-gun cufflinks, which he would spin when the opposing counsel was arguing to try to distract the jury. Things like that. But he had a lot of confidence and he had a big voice.
Big Joe Tannehill, you all are going to hear some of his arguments, as you will all the lawyers later on in the show. And I got to tell you, I don't exactly know what Mr. Shook is going to do with Tannehill's argument, but I can't wait to hear it. Then you've got a former clerk from the Court of Criminal Appeals, a very highly successful appellate prosecutor in Henry Wade's office that was opening up his own firm, and as near as I can tell, was the Texas expert for Belli and for Tannehill, and his name is Phil Burleson, and I believe that Mr. Burleson's family members are here. Some of them are. He came, and at the time, he was out of a 16-year career, I believe, with Henry Wade's office. He had a very successful career there, and Mr. Burleson can be seen here in this picture. Of note, Mr. Burleson is the only lawyer for Ruby that lasted from the beginning all the way until the end. A little bit more on how this case ended later. But that's Mr. Phil Burleson. He was also a participant, obviously, in the trial as well.
The year before, he had worked for Henry Wade and was chief of his appellate section. And he was a brilliant lawyer. I believe his record for the 3 years previous this trial was he made 100 arguments before different courts of appeals, and he won 93 of them. So Belli wanted a lawman, as he called it, and Thomas Howard had recommended Phil Burleson, and after an interview, they hired him. And his role in the trial primarily was to prepare memorandums, the legal objections, and you always need a good lawman when you're in a trial.
Phil Burleson. Now, on the other side, you have a legendary district attorney Henry Wade. Henry Wade, his father was a judge in Rockwall. He had 7, he was the 5th of 7 brothers, I believe. No, 5 of his 7 brothers were lawyers, which is impressive. He was a UT football player, the president of his law school class when he graduated with high honors, so he had an impressive resume. He was roommates in college with somebody that you all may recognize from the video, Governor Conley. That was his roommate in college. So when the assassination took place and his friend got shot, obviously, this was a personal case for Mr. Wade, not only because it happened here in his hometown, but because they had shot his friend and former roommate. He had been a prosecutor or the district attorney since 1951, so by the time this trial happened, he'd been there for about 12 years. Before he worked as a prosecutor or as the elected district attorney, he worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, including going down to South America and doing and collecting surveillance information on the Nazis down there. So he had quite an impressive resume, was by this time firmly entrenched as the elected district attorney. This was his, I believe I read that it was his 12th death penalty trial that he had done personally before he had been the district attorney. And Mr. Shook was hired by him, I believe.
They say that he was a brilliant lawyer, and his best skill was hiring talented lawyers, recognized talent. But he was a legend in Dallas, and at that time, he'd been DA since 1951, which was long. When I was at the DA's office, they used to have all the photos of all the other DAs, and from about from the beginning of Dallas history, there's about 30 of them, and then there was Mr. Wade for 36 years. So they hadn't had a DA that had served that long, and Dallas history was pretty wild in the 20s and 30s, and there was a lot of corruption in a lot of cities, and the Dallas leaders loved Henry Wade because he liked being DA, and he had the reputation of he wasn't corruptible. He and Bill Decker were known for cleaning up crime, and organized crime wasn't in Dallas. And they loved him, and by the time this trial came around, everyone in Dallas County knew him, and they respected him.
I got my numbers wrong. That 12 was wrong. He had a better record than that. He had 20. What was his record?
It's interesting. There's a great video where one of the national newscasters, when he announces he's seeking death, asked him if he's tried many death penalties, and he said, "Yeah, I've tried 24." And they said, "Well, how many did you get death?" And he said, 23. And then they cut to a commercial break after that. But he was successful in it.
So there's Henry Manasco Wade. Some of his family members are here, too. I would love to talk to y'all after this is all over. William F. Alexander, I know that his wife is here. Bill Alexander, Big Bill. There he is coming in to do, I believe, closing arguments. That is, at least, if not closing arguments in the trial, that's one day going into trial. But Bill Alexander was an Arkansas Razorback. He went to SMU. He was a captain in the U.S. Army in World War II. He was hired as a prosecutor in 1953 by Mr. Wade, and by the time that this trial happened 10 or so years, 11 years later, he was the chief felony prosecutor. He's the one that had 12 death penalty jury trials as the lead prosecutor under his belt by the time that we come here. Now, there's some really great things in those vitrines, one of my new favorite words back there, but Bill Alexander was present basically at every major part of the November 22nd, November 23rd, and November 24th during the killing. He was out writing search warrants. He was at the back of the Texas Theater when they arrested Lee Harvey Oswald. He interrogated Oswald and talked with Ruby as well. He knew Jack Ruby. They had had some dealings together in business-wise and also some business down at the DA's office. And so that's Big Bill Alexander. He took half of the trial. I mean, I would say mostly it was him and Henry Wade. We'll get into that a little bit later, but he had a really good way that he organized the file, some of which you can see on those cards in the vitrines. And what he did is he had a note card for every witness. And for each witness, there was a location on there. And he had the witnesses divided up alphabetically, but he also had the witnesses divided up by subject matter. And so if something was going to happen during the trial, he had these notebooks made, he had these cards made, and if he didn't know who the other side was going to be called, he would be able to pick up and run with the cross-examination. Now, the preparation that they did in this case was spectacular, and we'll talk a little bit about more on that later.
He was a living legend. I had the privilege of getting to know him when he was a defense attorney. But the thing about Mr. Alexander was he was known for being able to needle the opposition during the trial, get them off base, hence the fruit boots comments to Mr. Belli. And in return, whatever they said to him really didn't bother him. And you'll see that actually worked to their advantage some during the trial.
So those are the lawyers. The very first thing that happened in a courtroom in this case were the bail hearings, as we said before. So we're talking now about bail hearings from January of 1963 and then February of 1964. I want to just describe the picture, and then Mr. Shook, you can talk about what the issue is in a bail hearing. It's not that different than today. That picture is actually from Judge Brown's courtroom. This was with the, as I'm told, the newly discovered or invented fisheye camera lens, but that is Judge Brown, Joe Brown. He was the presiding judge in this trial. That was his courtroom. Now, the trial was actually later moved to Judge Wilson's courtroom, but this was his view, and this is actually a picture taken during a break of the bail hearing. So tell us what the issue is in a bail hearing in a capital case.
Okay, and one moment before I do that, we left out a couple of prosecutors.
Oh,
Jim Bowie.
Yep.
Jim Bowie was one of Mr. Wade's top prosecutors. He later became one of the most well-respected judges. And he was the prosecutor's lawman. He knew constitutional law left and right. Even Melvin Belli, who got into it with prosecutors, really respected Mr. Bowie. And then the other prosecutors, Mr. Watts, who actually was considered one of the top trial lawyers, but during the trial he developed laryngitis, I think, and more or less stayed behind the scenes and organized things. But the bail hearings, every defendant's entitled to bail, obviously upon being charged. And in a capital case, bail can be withheld if the DA moves and it can be proven that the death penalty, they call it proof is evident that they're likely, if convicted, to get the death penalty. And in this case, you have to have a hearing about that. And so that was the first hearing in December of 1963. There were 2 bail hearings. And at that case, they started out, Mr. Wade didn't want to show all his cards, which is one of the reasons the defense wanted it. They wanted to get some discovery. And I believe they only put on 2 witnesses.
They didn't put on very many witnesses, that's right.
And it was, Mr. Lavelle, did you testify at the bail hearing? I know Captain Fritz did. Yep. And so Mr. Lavelle did, who we have here. He obviously was there because he was kind of close to the action one time, right next to Oswald. And then Captain Will Fritz.
I don't think Oswald was there.
No.
If Oswald was there, we'd be in trouble. They did have to prove the man was dead.
Yeah.
So they did. I think he meant Ruby. There's a little note up there that says, trouble always follows Little Lynn. More about that story later, but as it relates to this bail hearing, Little Lynn was a dancer at the Carousel Club, and she was going to be called by the defense at the bail hearing to talk about how this was a happenstance deal, that there was no plan on behalf of Ruby there's no way he could have known what was happening. And, of course, Little Lynn is the one who needed money. Ruby was going to wire her money, and this is when he saw a crowd, according to them, and went down into the basement. So they have that. Now, the problem with Little Lynn, trouble always follows Little Lynn. I mean, there's the part where she wanted money to be wired, and, of course, Ruby killed Oswald after Little Lynn needed her money. And then at the bail hearing, she comes in to testify in court, and she forgot that she had a pistol in her purse. So, of course, she was taken into the judge's chambers where she was interrogated by the United States attorney at the time and friend of Mr. Snipes, Mr. Barefoot Sanders. Interrogated her. Judge Brown listened to her. She was testified about kind of what I told you, that she needed money. Ruby gave her the money in a Western Union telegram. That was a centerpiece of this trial. And then she was let out and she was arrested, and she bonded out by Tom Howard. Tom Howard bonded her out. Just remember that trouble always follows Little Lynn, because it may come back up during the trial itself.
The other testimony that was put on briefly was the defense called the telegraph operator that actually wired the money, because that was important. It'd be important in trial. It showed that the money was wired at 11:17 a.m., and then Oswald was killed at 11:21 a.m., 4 minutes later. Ruby actually, and that was about 150 yards away, that office. He walked down, was able to get down the ramp, and then a couple of minutes later, they brought Oswald by and the shooting happened. So the defense wanted to show, first of all, that they wanted to kind of get good publicity out their side of the story, get some sympathy for Ruby, and we're starting to try to educate the jury pool.
So you've got unprecedented media access during the bail hearings and the change of venue hearing. That is in court, in a break. Can you imagine the lawyers who try cases now having the media surround and interview the defendant who's on trial for a death penalty case? Just talking to him. Hey, Jack, how you think it's going? Oh, good. How we doing over there, Melvin? Oh, we're good. I think we're good. We're going to, but that's how it was. They just interviewed him. It's kind of like we're in recess, and then whoo, everybody would descend upon the counsel table, which is fascinating for me as a judge and a lawyer. I can't even imagine that. Those pictures are interesting, though, because they speak a little bit to what Mr. Shook was talking about. You see Melvin Belli there, closest to the camera. Back on his right shoulder, you can see both of his hands, is, of course, Mr. Ruby. And then to Ruby's right is Joe Tannehill. Now, behind him is Tom Howard. And Tom Howard is the one. I think it's interesting just because he's behind. He doesn't really ever seem to be involved. They were basically nudging him out kind of from the get-go. And this is one of the last times I think Mr. Howard was involved.
They broke for this hearing, and we're going to resume the hearing later, but that's when Thomas Howard left the case. Belli didn't want him. Belli didn't trust him. And Belli didn't want anything to do with his defensive theory. Belli wanted the all-or-nothing win. He wanted to go with insanity. In fact, he decided to go on insanity when he met Earl Ruby when they first met, especially when Earl told him that he had been in a mental hospital himself. He didn't quite know what his insanity evidence was going to be, but that's when he made the decision. And he didn't want anything to do with the murder with malice defense.
The other thing about that picture in particular is that there's a young man on the right side with his back. You can see his shoulder. I just kind of put that up there as an homage. That's Bill Winfrey. Most of the pictures that you're going to see tonight, he was taken, and this is obviously taken by somebody else, but he's in the frame. So the Bill Winfrey collection is here at the 6th Floor Museum, and I think that was pretty great. What about an entrance to Dallas, the venue hearing? Talk about a way to make an entrance.
Belli, after the second bond hearing, decided that maybe there was a little too much publicity in this case for Dallas County. So he filed for a change of venue hearing. And his theory was he wanted that moved because he felt, as he told in a interview with the New York Times, I believe it was, that the Dallas oligarchy is what he always referred to.
The oligarchy.
The city leaders, this ominous presence, wanted a conviction because they had to cleanse the city. They had to cleanse it of our sins, and the way to do that was to give Jack Ruby a fair trial in Dallas and then hang him. And he started with that theory, and, you had to admire the man's confidence because they say a good defense is a good offense. Well, he issued 200 subpoenas for the change of venue, and he hit everyone important in Dallas. The mayor, Earl Cobble, Stanley Marcus of Neiman Marcus, Jesse Curry, the police chief, the president of SMU. In fact, if you didn't get on the list and were served, then you felt pretty slighted that you weren't anything in Dallas. Yeah. And he didn't interview most of these people. His plan was to shame these leaders, to get them to say under oath that Jack Ruby couldn't get a fair trial in Dallas. And I think he took 3 days to put on this change of venue hearing.
3 days.
And very acrimonious. The lawyers already weren't getting along. They were doing lots of objection and lots of comments towards one another. And after 3 days, he rested, and Henry Wade introduced 38 affidavits to counter that, didn't call a witness, and then they argued. And Mr. Wade's argument was simple. He said, we don't know if we can get a fair trial. We're just going to have to see by picking the jury.
See about picking the jury. That was the joke was you're nobody unless you have a subpoena to the Jack Ruby change of venue hearing in Dallas. That was the joke. I've got another thing up there, Manley versus the state. I didn't know this. Maybe y'all knew this, but this was not the first time in the history of Dallas that a visit from the president was the reason for a killing that led to a trial where the death penalty was assessed and came with a change of venue. But in 1909, President Taft came, one of the people that was guarding the crowd, got into it with one of the other folks and ran through him with a bayonet, and they had a jury trial, and the man was given the death penalty. There was a change of venue was the issue in the case, much like it was here in Dallas in the Jack Ruby trial. I thought that was an interesting little side note. This is from the venue hearing. This Bill Alexander on your left with Henry Wade. This, I'm assuming, was a staged photograph. I don't know. Maybe they were getting into it at the time. Probably not. There's some stage photos. There's a lot of them there. But in the change of venue hearing, you see in front of Mr. Alexander, I thought this was interesting that Mr. Fagan pointed out. That's a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald there. And this is them getting ready for the change of venue hearing. This is actually the change of venue. Now, we're my Dallas County lawyers that work over the Frank Crowley. The idea, this is to y'all, that we're the first generation where you can only take pictures through the glass in the courtroom and get those crazy pictures with the blurry edges. That started a long time ago. This is actually taken through. That's Melvin Belli standing up, and he's going after the witness in this change of venue hearing named Mr. Bloom, Sam Bloom.
Sam Bloom was a big kind of PR guy. In fact, Judge Brown, the presiding judge, had hired him to kind of be his PR guy, and he corralled the press. He had the international press there, and he was an important guy because he could get you your seat. And Belli didn't like him, really went after him during the change of venue hearing, thought he was leaking information and getting the newspapers to say negative things about his client.
The change of venue hearing. Well, next up in any criminal trial, at least in this one, was the jury selection. This is the picture from the central jury room of Dallas County, down in the county criminal courts room. This was taken of the potential jurors. The quote up there is the Wade Office Espionage Network. That's not coined by me, okay? None of this stuff is coined by me. But this in particular came from Mr. Belli in his book in describing the lengths and the research that Mr. Wade and his crew did on the potential jurors. I bring that up in particular because there's some of the actual jury cards are in the back. They had a number of information. They had a lot of information about that, even including on you, Mr. Rose, who's here in the front of the front row here. They had information on everybody, and Belli referred to him as the Office Espionage Network. You had some experience with that too.
That's right. They had big books when I first started at the DA's office, and it had every juror had been on a jury, and the prosecutors would rate them after the trial, what kind of case it was, that sort of thing. And Mr. Wade started those records right away. He was also, in this case, they were aggressive. They'd get the jury list, and they passed it around the entire office. And he was so well connected that usually if he didn't know you, he found someone that knew you. And Belli was kind of, I think, becoming impressed that the prosecutors were a lot better than he anticipated. In fact, Thomas Howard had said that Belli was somewhat shocked after the first bond hearing at how good of lawyers they really were.
So we go into jury selection. Again, you've got some unprecedented media access right during the middle of voir dire. Let's have an interview with the defendant, see what's happening to get an idea of the scope of that. Now we've taken just about, I mean, boy, oh boy, it's got to be every news outlet that there is, right?
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
My goodness. So that was the jury selection. That was voir dire. We know from the trial that there were 168 panelists called. 127 were dismissed for cause, 68 by the state, 58 by the defense. One was six. So you've got 11 peremptories by the state and 18 by the defense. But what I wanted Toby to talk about is the first couple days. There was some question about this change of venue. Right. Judge Brown never made a ruling after the change of venue hearing, and he carried it for jury selection.
He was carrying it, the motion, and Judge Brown was one of those people that if you're with him and talking to him, then you thought he was agreeing with you. And Melvin Belli didn't realize that, and apparently he told Mr. Belli, yep, I'm probably going to have to change this. And he was very confident that this case, as things developed, that they would Judge Brown would eventually change the trial to another county. And in a capital case, the jury selection's one at a time. They put the juror on the witness stand, and then the state goes first and the defense. And you make your decisions at that time, if they're not disqualified, whether you're going to take them or not. And you only get 15 strikes, peremptory strikes, and then you have to select these jurors. Well, Belli felt that his strategy to cement this change of venue, he was going to make as much trouble as he could. And so the very first juror, he took 3 hours on, and one of the questions he asked was, did you see the shooting? He said yes, and he said we have to disqualify this juror because he's a witness in the case. And a couple of days he went at it that way, trying to disqualify jurors that way. But, he was known as the king of torts, and he could be very charming when he wanted to be, and had picked plenty of juries, but he wasn't charming the first 4 days. He was very obnoxious, very insulting, insulted some of the jurors, and wound up burning 7 strikes in the first 4 days. And about the 4th day, he figured out Judge Brown wasn't going to change the trial, so he was in a hole. He only got 15 strikes, and he was 7 down. And he had even struck some of the jurors he normally would have liked. So he started in a hole and put himself in a bad position.
Yep. So this is, after all of those weeks, we have the jury here. This is the first juror was chosen, became the foreperson, and that's Max Causey. He was chosen after, as Mr. Shook said, 3.5 days. And then he was asked a question by Mr. Belli. Well, do you think that you can give him a fair trial here in Dallas? And he said, of course I can. I'm not from Dallas. I'm from Garland. So that was your, he became the foreperson. Now, I've got up there the jurors' plight. These jurors were sequestered. Mr. Causey was taken and led upstairs to converted jail cells. And that's where they lived for the duration of the trial. Mr. Causey, of course, lived there longer than any of the others because he was the first one. And so I guess day after day, if you read his book, he would just kind of wonder if anybody's coming, and nobody would come. And then he got a knock on the door. And there was juror number 2. And then a knock on the door. And there's juror number 3. And they spent a whole lot of time together. Mr. Rose is here. You can see Mr. Rose in the back right. He was asked a question on jury selection about an Alabama football player. And this was something that Mr. Belli loved. The Alabama football player, my brother-in-law, Alabama. This is stories for you, buddy. Alabama football player came off the bench and tackled a Rice football player. And was so caught up in the moment that he came off the bench and tackled him. And, of course, that was just right in line with what Melvin Belli was saying about what happened with Jack Ruby. And so Mr. Belli, picked Wayman Rose. He thought you were going to be the foreperson of the jury. Didn't work out just like that. But that is a picture of the jury. This is a picture that was taken in the courtroom. The jurors actually posed for this picture, and I think it's a pretty fantastic picture right there. That was their plight. They had to go, they would leak. I understand that they would leak to the spouses where y'all were going to go for dinner, and then maybe the spouses would meet them there. But of course, the press wanted to hound them and follow them wherever they went, but they did not. And there was one of the jurors had made a comment that he said, you can have 1 beer, and he said, okay, well, let's make it a big beer. You can't have more than 1 beer, but as long as there's a big beer. I don't know if you said that or not, Mr. Rose, but if you did, I think it's a great quote. We do have an interview, of course, of what the lawyers thought about their jury.
At the end of the tedious process of jury selection, Chief Defense Lawyer Melvin Belli remarked about the unusually advanced educational level of the jurors.
I think that the level of this jury here is much higher than the cross-section of intelligence of Dallas, and I don't say that disrespectfully.
District Attorney Henry Wade added his comments.
I think it's a high-class jury. From what we know, it seems to be fair and impartial is all I could say about it. You never know what a jury is, what type of jury is till they return a verdict, of course, but it appears all right for everything we know about it.
See, it's a valuable lesson. You see the contrast between the two lawyers. Belli, in his unique way, insults all of the Dallas
every single one of us.
And I don't even think he realized he was doing it. And then you got Henry Wade, who says he's a high-class jury, and he says he thinks he'll be fair. I think he already had a good idea that he had a pretty good jury. In fact, later on it was said he was very happy with the jury that he got, and mainly because Belli got put in a hole. But they wanted an intelligent jury, but sometimes that's not good for the defense to have a real intelligent jury.
An intelligent jury, not representative of a cross-section of Dallas, but it's an intelligent jury. I thought it was great. Wednesday, March 4th, 1964, preparation was complete. I told you a little bit about the filing system. They had a very, very impressive filing system. Of course, one of the very hardest things for lawyers to do is to kind of assimilate that information and come up with a witness list. Two of the neatest things that I think are in the file that you can see over there is the one of the original witness lists of the order of the trial. That was, you can see it's kind of marked through and they changed a little bit, but that was disseminated about. The other one, of course, we'll get to later is the closing argument notes, the actual notes of Henry Wade on the yellow legal pad. But Wednesday, March 4th, it was a Wednesday, they started with the trial.
And it should be noted that they finished jury selection on March 3rd. So typical, it's still moving fast, and so the lawyers didn't get much rest. And you talked about preparation. One of the things we forgot to tell you, the second bond hearing, Belli called 2 psychiatrists to testify, and he at first the prosecutors objected because they were talking about their findings, and then they realized that Melvin Belli was about to lay out his complete defense for them, so they sat back and watched. And these psychiatrists later testified, and they basically laid out the defense that Jack Ruby was insane at the time because he was suffering from psychomotor epilepsy and was in a seizure, in a fugue state, as they said. He didn't know what he was doing when he killed Lee Harvey Oswald. And after they got that information, Wade sent his prosecutors to the various cities, and when they mentioned epilepsy was the cause of this, that really got the president of the National Epilepsy Association angry, and he called up the DAs and directed them to all the top experts and psychiatrists, and they developed a very good preparation to take on this insanity defense. In fact, it was said later after the jury selection, they were confident, but they figured that this psychomotor epilepsy defense had to be some kind of trick on Belli's part because there's no way that was going to work. And they thought he was hiding something and coming up with it.
You've got a good long line waiting to get in. That's the records building that's across the street. I guess I should have said that first. It still looks exactly the same in the little entryway. To me, it does anyway. The steps are there. But this was the trial of the century. It was all over obviously the news, the media, all over Dallas. This was a place to be. This is an interesting picture to me. This is the courtroom that it was actually taken in. There's a few people that I wish were there but are not. But you can see Judge Brown presiding. In the forefront, you have Henry Wade, and then next to him, I believe it's Jim Bowie, and then Frank Watts is to his right. Bill Alexander isn't present in that picture. I really wish that he was, but behind Mr. Watts is Joe Tannehill, Melvin Belli, and then I believe that's Mr. Burleson all the way over to the right on the left edge of the picture. But that is the courtroom. That's one of the few courtroom pictures that we have of the actual trial itself. So we've got the state's case, and the way we're going to do this is we're just going to sort of break down each of the different phases of the trial. What you have is, of course, the state has the burden of proof. They go first. Then the defense can put on evidence if they want to, and they did. And then the state can rebut that evidence if they want to, and they did. And the defense can rebut that evidence if they want to, and they did. And then the state could rebut that rebuttal if they want to, and they did. And then one more time for the defense, and then we rest. That's it. Those 7 sections, just like that.
All in 2 weeks.
All in 10 days. Yeah. So here we go. The state's case. This is summed up by a quote from one of the lawyers, an unnatural wanting on the part of Jack Ruby to be around Lee Harvey Oswald. That's what Bill Alexander said in his closing argument about what I would sum up as this phase of the trial. What they're doing is you all remember malice aforethought, one way to prove, or that they had to prove a capital offense that would also defeat this insanity defense, and the defendant did plead insanity, is to prove that it was a premeditated killing with malice aforethought. And so what they set out to do was to trace the steps of Jack Ruby. He started out the Friday that President Kennedy was in town in the Dallas Morning News. And while the parade was going by, he was up there in the Dallas Morning News doing an ad for his Carousel Club that weekend. He expected there to be a lot of business. He was there when that was happening. When they found out that the president had been assassinated, he was still in the Dallas Morning News, and there was testimony that he had an emotional reaction, as most everybody did, and that he had this fixed stare about him for a little while. And of course, Belli seized on that. Anything unusual, anything that seemed out of sorts, Belli was very good, and so was Tannehill, about seizing on and getting the witness to further explain that. But then you've got Ruby's pass, as the DA set out, followed to this press conference. And there was a press conference after Lee Harvey Oswald was caught at the Dallas Police Department in the basement. And you actually have Henry Wade giving an interview and talking about the case and Lee Harvey Oswald and all that. And he mentions the fair play for Cuba. And there's a voice in the back that corrects him about the true name, and that is Jack Ruby. He had been down and made himself a part of this press conference. He was acting like a reporter for that day after he bought a bunch of sandwiches for everybody, and he was passing out his Carousel Club card. The Jada card, or Jada, I always call her Jada, her name's Jada card that you see in one of those vitrines is one of the cards he was actually passing out to some of the reporters there. And that's going to be important later on. And then you've got the next day, you've got him at the Dealey Plaza with Wes Wise, where he was talking. And go ahead. Objection.
One other thing he did. Sorry, just it was one other thing he did. He loved reporters, and he loved being around cops, and he liked knowing important people. And he got on. He was on the phone, a pay phone, when Mr. Wade was down there, and he was talking to a radio reporter. And he said, "You want an interview with Henry Wade?" And he said, "Sure." So he put the phone down and said, "Mr. Wade, would you like to come over here and talk to this reporter on the radio?" And Mr. Wade said, "Yeah." And he did an interview. Well, that really, I told about the Alexander needling the defense. They needled Henry Wade at the trial on that. And it was constantly, "Were you there when Jack Ruby talked to his friend Henry Wade?" And go over and over. And Mr. Wade didn't like that. But they would constantly make issue of Henry Wade, get an interview, and Jack Ruby got him on the phone.
It was his friend Hank. Would you see your friend Hank?
Oh,
I always referred to him as that. Made Henry Wade pretty upset. Would me too. So you've got them sort of going through, and then, of course, one of the last things they did is they introduced this Western Union telegram that I had mentioned before with a timestamp on it, and then, of course, 150 yards away is the entrance to the garage, and then we have the testimony of Officer Lavelle, Mr. Lavelle. He was the last person to speak with Lee Harvey Oswald, as I understand it. He felt the bullet in the back of him and actually collected it, and that bullet was introduced in the trial. But he heard some statements, and I think the next part of the case is really going to be what some of those statements were. So you've got the first part where he was inserting himself around where Lee Harvey was, and then you have this collection of statements, one of which was one that Mr. Lavelle heard, and that was, "I hope the SOB dies," that Ruby had said as he was immediately after the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald. "I hope the SOB dies." Now, Mr. Belli had big problems with any statements that were made by Mr. Ruby, obviously because they showed what was on his mind, but his argument was that statements that are made while you're in police custody are inadmissible, and so there's a series of statements that were gotten out by Mr. Alexander and Mr. Wade afterward, in succession at the end of their case. There's the one that was testified to by Officer McMillan and Patrick Dean and Mr. Archer. Sort of think about it like this. There's the statements that were made right during the killing, and that was one of these, I don't know if I'm allowed to say it, but "you rat SOB," and then the shot. Okay, and then as he falls down on the ground, so there's a statement of the shot, and then there's a statement on the ground. "I'm Jack Ruby, y'all know me, I'm Jack Ruby." So there's that statement as well. They take him off you see him take him over through the door back into where they had just gotten Lee Harvey Oswald from. They take him up, and there was another statement that was testified to. He said, "I intended to shoot him, or I meant to shoot him 3 times. That was another statement that was testified to. And then they end on what I would call a bombshell. And this was a statement that was testified to by Mr. Patrick Dean. And his statement was that after this, when they take him up in the elevator and they go up after the killing, that Ruby said to Officer Dean, I had it in my mind when I saw that sneer on his face, if I ever had the chance to kill him, that I wanted to do it and I would kill him. He said that Ruby told him that on Friday, the day before. Well, now we have something that was very important for the prosecution. We have premeditation and malice aforethought. Remember, that's what the lawyers were trying to prove in this case.
The defense obviously wanted to keep those statements out. Their argument was Ruby was in custody once they grabbed him, and that these statements shouldn't come in. The state argued these are res gestae statements, which you'll hear about later when the defense lawyers started their arguments. But they were hurtful because obviously the defense theory is Ruby doesn't know, and he's going to have psychiatrists testify that if you're in a epileptic seizure or if you're in a fugue state, you can't remember what happened. So these statements by Jack Ruby after the shooting that he remembered, how many times he was going to shoot, and why he shot, showed memory, and that caused a big problem for Belli. So once Judge Brown let that in, he didn't sustain the defense objection. In fact, I only think he sustained about 3 objections by the defense. But they had a problem. So Belli then's problem in Tannehill was to cross-examine and try to make it look like that could have been someone else, or Ruby might have been responding to what other officers were saying, things like that. But Archer and McMillan were young officers.
McMillan.
The interesting thing was they were young officers, and they testified very damaging statements. Detective Lavelle and Detective Graves, who were actually with Ruby, didn't hear as many of the statements. Of course, they're in the middle of it, and they were older officers. And then Sergeant Dean gave other statements that were let in that said, hey, I did it because I didn't want Jackie to have to come here for the trial. I wanted to show the world that Jews had guts and things like that. And so Belli was really dug in a hole once those 3 witnesses, Archer, McMillan, and Dean, had testified.
Yeah, you're talking about statements that were made immediately around the killing, so those, what we would normally think of as res gestae, the further away you get, and certainly when you're talking about being in handcuffs, things like that, it's kind of shaky. That was one of the appellate grounds. But with this bombshell statement that 36 hours before the killing, he had said to somebody else, if I ever get the chance, I'm going to take him out. That obviously was a significant statement. So now it's time for, this was on a Friday afternoon, by the way, when they arrested. So in the morning, after around the lunch break is when they rested, and now it's time for Mr. Belli to do his opening statement. But I told you the problem is that trouble always follows Little Lynn. Toby's very famous for prosecuting the Texas 7. I see Detective Randall Johnson here. He was Irving detective. He was the lead detective on that, if y'all don't know about the Texas 7. But that was a big jailbreak that happened here. Well, it happened down south, and then it wound up here in Dallas. Toby tried all those cases with Detective Johnson, among others. But there was a jailbreak, of course, in the Jack Ruby trial, as Little Lynn was going to get up and testify after the opening statement by Melvin Belli. What you see there is, on your left, that is an escaped inmate who had been caught. On the 6th or 7th floor above the trial, that was the jail. And the jailers were overtaken by the Ruby 7, if you want to call them that, and they had fashioned a gun, which you can see in that second picture right there on the right, out of soap, and they colored it with shoe polish. And to me, it looks pretty real. And they had taken a hostage. They bumped down Little Lynn and knocked her over. She was 9 months and a half pregnant at the time. But poor Little Lynn, after she testified, or after she's run over, she's got to go in there and testify. But we can hear a little bit about the trial or the defense's theory from Mr. Belli in his opening statement. Mr. Wade did not give an opening statement.
That was kind of the Dallas County tradition. Dallas County prosecutors didn't give opening statements. And if the prosecutor didn't give an opening statement, then the defense couldn't give an opening statement at the beginning of trial, which they wanted to do that because the jury didn't get to hear Belli's theory till they had already rested their case.
So we have the words of Melvin Belli. I say this not an argument, but in fact, that the fates conspired against Jack Ruby. He went right out here where wreaths were, and he went up to the Western Union office, left his little doggy in the car, told his doggy he was coming back, and we'll show you the influences, the impulses on his mind, and we'll show you what happened to this tragic man. Someday science will confirm that the fates conspired against Jack Ruby. One of the other things that you see up there in this exhibition is the actual EEG of Jack Ruby. And this was something that was right in line with what Mr. Belli was known for, and that was demonstrative evidence. He had been known to set up in a personal injury case a streetcar that had hurt somebody. He set everything up in the courtroom. So he was known for his demonstrative aids. That EEG, the one that you see over there, was his centerpiece of his defense. It was abnormal. There was an abnormal part in the reading of the EEG that even some of the state's psychiatrists or some of their own witnesses had agreed was a little bit abnormal. And his theory was that the fates conspired and you have a diseased mind, and the proof of that diseased mind was in the EEG. You have Ruby, who was known to be an emotional character, very volatile, very unpredictable. He mentioned the dogs. There was a dog named Sheba. Sheba was in the car, and Sheba had a special relationship with Jack Ruby, I guess, or Jack Ruby had a special relationship with Sheba.
Sheba was his wife.
Sheba was his wife.
That's what he told people. And Sheba was a weenie dog.
Dachshund.
Dachshund.
Weenie dog.
My mom taught me to call them weenie dogs. But Sheba was the head weenie dog, and he carried Sheba around everywhere with him.
Yeah, she would go Tammy True, I got to talk to her. She said that Sheba would come in and run around the club, and that would be there until the time for everybody to come, and then he would put little Sheba in the back and go about his business, but Sheba was with him. The implication was that this was more evidence that this was not a planned deal, that this man who loved his doggy so much would not leave his prized possession in the car, that he really did just go to give little Lynn her money and left his little doggy in the car, saw a crowd, and then walked down for the crowd, and then had this opportunity. And it was the fates that were conspiring with all of these things. When you have this diseased mind, he was an unpredictable character. Some good stories about him at the Carousel Club and how he might react.
They they wanted to show that Ruby was very emotional and would sometimes fight people or bounce people and didn't have a memory of it. So they would put on these witnesses before they put on any of their experts to give examples of this. And they wanted to show that he thought of this Sheba as his wife or his favorite dog, and then all the other little dogs. And they had like 4 other weenie dogs.
Oh, it was his children.
And they were his children. And
he referred to as his children.
They put on a guy named Sewer who was a good friend of his, and he said, the dogs would tear up stuff in his house, and he said, don't call those dogs, these are my children, and don't disrespect my children or my wife, things like that. So they wanted to show how eccentric and strange Jack Ruby acted.
Pretty strange.
And of course, the cross examinations, we can't get into all of them, but were great. Sewer said all this, but then he was cross-examined by Bill Alexander, who was very good at, this is conservative 1964 Dallas, so he wanted to point out to the jury, so you go to the burlesque club every night, do you, Mr. Sewer? And does your wife let you do that, Mr. Sewer? And Belli didn't really catch on that most Dallas jury wouldn't appreciate a man who went to the Carousel Club every night. So
we also know from them what Ruby, they further illustrated what Ruby did. Okay, they illustrated a little bit more. We have the path that Ruby took, and the state had brought some of that out. And what we see from the defense is they sort of illuminate that a little bit more, that Ruby woke up he was up at about 3 a.m. and woke up his roommate because he was incensed and had finally made a connection between a newspaper that he tore out. The original newspaper is there in that vitrine over there. That's actually one that he had in his possession. He tore it out. This was the newspaper that said, "Welcome, Mr. President." It was surrounded by a black border, which he took to be a threat, and that there was signed at the bottom by Bernard Wiseman. Well, he had seen a billboard that said, "Impeach Earl Warren." And it was signed by, I believe, Bernard Wiseman, or there was a post office box at the bottom, too. So he gets his roommate, George Senator. They go to the Carousel Club, and they round up a boy there named, I'll think of it in just a minute, but he has a Polaroid camera. They go at 3 in the morning and take a picture of this Earl Warren, impeach Earl Warren sign, go back to the Carousel Club. They go back then to drop him off. They have breakfast. And then it's at 10:30 after that. That's the Jack Ruby that walked into the Western Union store. So they illuminate that a little bit further. Actually, one other place that they went was the post office box that was listed for Mr. Weissman on the Earl Warren sign. Then we go on to the doctors there in the defense's case. The doctors had looked at him and they examined him, and they're the ones. There was one named Goodmacher who testified at the end, and that is finally the one who says that Jack Ruby does not know right from wrong, thus satisfying the insanity defense.
The problem was they had to put several doctors on ahead of time. There was a Dr. Schaefer who had conducted all the forensics tests and actually hooked him up, and they did the EEG tracings, which Belli valued so much. But these witnesses, the way Belli put it on, were all going to lead up to Dr. Gottmacher's final opinion, and the prosecutors would stop each one and ask, well, do you have an opinion about his sanity? Did he know right from wrong at the time of the shooting? And they'd all respond, no, I don't, which I think carried a lot of weight with the jurors. All these experts that were examining the defendant didn't have an opinion. And also, all the tests showed that they ran him through, he was normal and everything. And they were very careful in their cross-examinations to emphasize that to the jury, that Ruby was showing to be normal in all aspects except for this brain waves that we saw in the tracings, which they said was really organic brain damage. And then the other big problem with their star witness that they finished the first part of their case on, he was a renowned psychiatrist, but he didn't think Jack Ruby did the killing in the fit of a psychomotor epileptic seizure, which was kind of bad because that's what Belli had been telling the jury what it was all about. And, he tried to slip that by a little bit. He gave the classic, he had a weak ego, he was under a day and a half of a very emotional stress, he had this family history, and I believe at the time of the killing he did not know right or wrong from his acts. And yes, he has psychomotor epilepsy, but he didn't go quite that far. Now, if it wasn't clear to the jury on direct, Bill Alexander made it very clear on cross-examination and got the doctor to say, I'm not saying that this happened in a state of psychomotor epilepsy, just that he has psychomotor epilepsy. And so when your star witness doesn't go along with what you've been saying in opening statement and your theory, it kind of puts you in a much bigger hole.
They were real mad about old McMillan and Archer, and they talk about them in the closing argument. One of the things that they did, too, in this part of the case is they had a picture of McMillan where he was looking away, which wouldn't have, in other words, it wasn't possible for him to hear or see what he said he was, and of course, Archer was too far away to hear what he said, too. So they rest. The state comes back with their own experts. Now we're in the rebuttal phase of the state's case. What the state had to deal with was the claw hand. This is kind of a neat illustration. I read about it. I didn't really see it in the picture by Bob Jackson. This is the picture by Bob Jackson, a very famous one. The Sixth Floor did this picture for the advertisement, but you can see Ruby's middle finger sticking out of the trigger. And Belli snatched and grabbed onto that as further proof that Ruby wasn't in his right mind, because who in their right mind is going to shoot a gun, a little pistol, a .38 Cobra like that with their middle finger? So he snatched onto that as well. We go to the next phase of the case. Now, as I go to this, I want to tell you all that you need to give, if you have questions to the Sixth Floor folks that are going to be coming around, make sure you write those down and pass them to the end of the row. They've already got them? Thank you. Very good. This was not the act of an automaton. What you've got here then to rebut this, and we're going to run through this real quick, Toby. I feel like we might be running out of time. We've got to get to the closing arguments. Obviously, there was a lot of media around, and so there was a lot of newsmen around, and the state found in their rebuttal that one of the men who worked at KLIF, I believe, had actually a conversation with Ruby at around 10:30. So this was 40 minutes before this Western Union telegram, where Ruby was asking this radio man if they have brought him down yet. Further proof, according to the state, that he was looking for and trying to get around Lee Harvey Oswald, and that he was not in this fugue state that was so put up and sold by the defense.
And the state then put on their experts. Since they had a preview of the defense, went and found experts from Texas, but as well as experts from all over the United States, and guys from Harvard, guys from Johns Hopkins, guys from University of Wisconsin. And then they started putting them on. And they had waves of them. I think the first rebuttal, they put on like 5 experts. Then the defense put on some more. And then they put on about 5 more. And I think they had about 5 more waiting in the wings if they thought they needed them. But these were very good experts, and they all disagreed. They all said, yeah, he may have some brain waves, but this is not someone that was acting in a fugue state or in an epileptic seizure at all. And the other thing, they were really good, the state, at pulling out things. Belli made a great point showing that middle finger, the firing, and then Bill Alexander puts on some colonel who had been head of the United States Air Force shooting team, who said, using your middle finger is the way we teach people to do quick firing.
Instinct shooting.
Instinct shooting. That's instinct shooting. So boom, you think you're going good, and then you got some colonels saying that's instinct shooting. So that was good rebuttal evidence. So the state put their experts on, and then they rested.
We've got more from the defense now. They kept referring to the father of the electroencephalogram, the creator, the guy who had studied this and started it back in 1933, Dr. Gibbs. And both sides have referred to him during the trial. What they were going to try to do, the last rebuttal that the state did, is they put forth evidence. They took 5 EEGs. They didn't tell this doctor. This was a pretty ingenious trick. They didn't tell the doctor that they were about to put up which one was Jack Ruby, okay? But they put up 5 EEGs. They gave it to the doctor, sort of a blind test of EEGs, and they didn't tell her which one was Jack Ruby's, and she examined them all and said, well, these 2 are normal, these 2 are not, and this one is kind of in the middle. Ruby's turned out to be normal. So that was a pretty good strategic call on the state's part. Excellent. Now, we've got all of this is being reported, of course, in every news outlet that there is, and there's a guy named Gibbs who's reading this stuff, and he hears about it from Chicago.
Gibbs was the person who invented this science of getting these brainwave tracings and had fathered all this. I think he started in 1932 when he came up with it, and psychomotor epilepsy. And so all the experts referred to him, but no one thought he was going to show up because he didn't want to come testify. He didn't want to subject himself to cross-examination. But he read about what was being said. He was upset, and it was kind of funny, is since the lawyers didn't think he was going to come, the prosecutors let them kind of build him up, and I'm sure they were going to make light of that in closing argument. Gibbs didn't even show up. And so all of a sudden, he shows up. He flies in on his own dime at night, and he's going to testify, be the star witness to pull it out at the very end for the defense.
Yes.
And he gets on the stand. It was in the Friday morning of the last day of trial.
Friday morning.
And Belli puts him on. It takes him 24 minutes. He said, I've looked at it, and yes, Jack Ruby has psychomotor epilepsy. Ooh. And they turn him over. And so Bill Alexander takes him on cross and starts asking him questions. And then he comes up and says, well, do you have an opinion, doctor? Gibbs, if Jack Ruby knew right from wrong, knew what he was doing when he shot Lee Harvey Oswald? No, I don't. And that was the way they ended the trial. Not on a good note for the defense.
But it was described in one of the books, I don't know if it was Mr. Rose or Mr. Causey's journal, as a bombshell. It was Causey's journal of a bombshell, that Alexander had dropped the bomb. And that's how this trial, this testimony ended. You've got 64 witnesses, 22 civilians, 17 doctors testified. I put up there 15-2 for the state because if you look at all the doctors that testified, 2 of them said that Ruby was insane. 15 of them either said he was not insane or they had no opinion. Either way you look at it, the scorecard isn't good. As a matter of fact, there was only 3 people in the whole trial who testified that he was insane. Those 2 doctors, Gumacher and Bromberg, and then Rabbi Silverman. So there was 3 people, if you want to look at it, against the 64 that testified. And we had 13 reporters, 12 police officers, and 1 jailbreak. This is my other favorite part. We got a game break here. Let's go to Joe Tannehill and see, Mr. Tannehill, how we're doing on the jury charge.
There's a lull in activity here at the Dallas County Criminal Courts building after optimism reigned supreme this morning that perhaps by this time this evening the jury would have the case of Jack Ruby. But such is not the case. Objections to the charge being prepared for the jury delaying proceedings here. Of the defense counsel, Joe Tannehill of Jasper, Texas, would you give us what some of those objections are and why the delay?
Well, Murphy, as you know, we're down to the most serious part of the lawsuit now, and that's the preparation of the charge or the instructions for the jury. The charge is customarily prepared by the district attorney here in Texas and submitted to the judge, although it is expected that the judge does that function, however, but it's done in Texas by the district attorneys. In this particular instance, there's an awful lot of zeal on the part of the district attorney to obtain a conviction, and therefore they have very skillfully prepared a charge that is highly objectionable to us. It amounts to nothing less than a cold-blooded murder charge, and is so artfully prepared that I consider it to be an instructed verdict of guilty. It has comments upon the weight of the evidence. It assumes facts and assumes malice on the part of the defendant when our main defense is that the act was committed in a state of insanity, and of course if it's done in a state of insanity there can be no malice in the defendant's mind because his mental factors were suspended at the time and he had no consciousness of what he was doing. And so if you go before the jury with a charge that assumes that the defendant acted with malice, you can see what that would do to our defense.
Joe, when do you think we will start final arguments now?
In all likelihood around 8 o'clock tonight or else in the morning. I just spoke with Judge Brown and suggested that we'll go ahead and get the charge in proper shape tonight, read the charge to the jury. It contains about 11 legal-sized pages, and then start oral argument in the morning at 8 o'clock. The judge is willing to do it. He knows everyone is tired and exhausted, but he's going to leave it up to the jury and let them vote on it, and that will be their first vote as to when we start arguing this case.
Murphy Martin, ABC.
Closing arguments did actually begin on Friday the 13th at 8 o'clock in the evening. The jurors had said they were ready to hear this, and they wanted to go. You got 7 lawyers, 5 hours, 1 on-field interview that we'll talk about here in a little bit, and a steam bath. Melvin Belli, before his argument, went to the Dallas Athletic Club and took a steam bath and had a rub down beforehand. But we start out with Bill Alexander. And we're going to read just some selections of these arguments because they're fantastic. This is from Bill Alexander. It is incumbent upon the state to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that on or about the 24th day of November 1964, with malice aforethought, that Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm not going to fuss at the other lawyers. Vituperation is not logic. The evidence shows an unnatural wanting on behalf of this defendant to be in the presence of Lee Harvey Oswald, the man that professes his love for the president, couldn't even stir himself enough to walk 5 blocks down to see the president and his wife. This shows the mind and the heart of Jack Ruby. I want to talk to you about this psychomotor business. I'm not trying to be funny, but I wonder if they got their psychomotor variant from the psychomotor pool. I have seen enough to know that any time a jury is considering a murder case, the first question they are going to ask is, should the deceased have departed? I'm not going to defend Oswald to you, but I tell you this, American justice is on trial. American justice had Oswald in its possession. He was entitled to be tried in a court of justice just like you, Jack Ruby. Now don't tell me it takes guts to shoot a man that's manacled. It doesn't take any kind of guts like that. That's the thing the law seeks to deter and warrants the death penalty. I ask you for that because of the crime committed, the flagrant disregard for the life of Lee Harvey Oswald, and also because he mocked American justice while the spotlight of the world was on us.
And it was a very good, well-organized argument, said in a very loud voice, as many of the prosecutors and defense lawyers practiced at that time. He sat down, and they did... we don't do this these days, but they traded lawyers back and forth. So Alexander went first, and then it's the defense, and they went all the way through it, going that way, they called swing arguments. And so they would go back and forth. They'd send out their guy. And the first defense argument was done by Phil Burleson, who was the lawman. He didn't get to ask a lot of questions, but they wanted him to argue. He was the only Dallas lawyer that had been at the table. But he's a great appellate lawyer, but Phil Burleson was also a trial lawyer and a very good one. It was the one lawyer who talked in the more subdued tones throughout his argument. But Alexander had made a big deal. Remember at the beginning of the trial how Jack Ruby, he's supposed to have done this and was gone insane because of his great love for President Kennedy. Yet at the time of the parade and the shooting, he was down there putting an advertisement in for who was going to be dancing at the Carousel Club that night. And so Alexander had made a big deal about that and emphasized that in his closing argument. So Burleson answered. First he started out, the lawyers back then were so much better. They were kind of Shakespearean. And he started out going, feeble, 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 feeble is the state's chances of proving this case. But he addressed the parade, and he said, no parade. Some of you on the jury may not have gone to that parade. Gone home. Go home and ask your friends and your family. And when they tell you they didn't go, tell them they aren't patriotic. Wanted to set the tone that not everyone was at the parade that day. And then the best line he had, because, again, they have to prove the murder happened with malice, he said, the only malice that comes in this case is from the blistering lips of police officers.
Who was he talking about?
He was talking about those young boys, as they called them throughout the whole trial, Archer and McMillan and Dean, particularly Archer and McMillan, that they were the key to the state's case in these res gestae statements. He attacked the Dallas police in that way, but the most interesting part is, in the court's charge, he's the only defense lawyer that addressed maybe finding Ruby guilty of murder without malice, the old Thomas Howard defense strategy of that would limit the punishment up to 5 years. And he said this charge has it in there. If the murder is done in immediate influence, a sudden passion arising from adequate cause, you can find so. Jack Ruby had business problems. His sister just had an operation. The assassination of the president had happened on the streets of Dallas. There was impeachment of Earl Warren signs that he saw, took photos. And then he saw the sneering, smirking communist killer of the president. These are the things that would lead to adequate cause of anyone. And he's the only one that addressed that of the three defense lawyers, which caused some concern by the prosecution when they had to answer those arguments.
And Frank Watts stands up in their behalf in rebuttal to that, and he says, insanity is a simple rule devised by God-fearing people here in the state of Texas. As a man thinketh, so is he. I hope I killed the SOB. I meant to get off 3 shots. These words show a heart regardless of duty, a black, wicked heart. I say to you that he was sane in November. He's sane now. I say he was guilty then. He's guilty now. I say the blood is still red on the hands of Jack Ruby. Following Mr. Watts is Mr. Joe Tannehill.
And they say that, and now we're going late into the evening at this point in time, and one of the lady jurors had dozed off at the end of Mr. Watts' argument. And then Mr. Tannehill, who you got to see in his comments about the jury charge, he got to get up. And she was quickly awakened because Mr. Tannehill was bombastic, to say the least. And he argued for an hour and 6 minutes in a very, very loud voice. And it's the most entertaining reading you can get if you want to read these closing arguments. First thing he did was attack the prosecution. And some of the comments he had was, the prosecution is, and I may channel him a little bit in a minute, has sought to send a sick man, suffered from psychomotor epilepsy. I would love to hear him say that. Psychomotor epilepsy, gratifying nothing but political ambition. They demand that you do something to Jack Ruby to make up for the great political opportunity that Mr. Wade might have had to prosecute Lee Harvey Oswald. Then he had to take a shot at Mr. Wade. Mr. Wade is uncouth, unsavory, ungentlemanly, undignified, and the worst insult of all, un-Texan. He had referred that, would use that insult during objections throughout the trial, how un-Texan that was of you. Bill Alexander, the kid who had to take photographs of the Earl Warren sign, apparently blinked strangely because Bill Alexander mentioned in his argument. You remember that guy? He was a guy with wiggly eyes, and Tannehill was greatly. How could Bill Alexander, how un-Texan, to make fun of his physical defects and called him wiggly eyes. And so it was great. And then he wanted to get into, he didn't do it as eloquently as Belli had put on the testimony of Ruby's past mental problems, that he had something wrong with his brain. And I think he might have started losing the jury when he said, when going over that, let's go back when Jack Ruby was born, an extremely large child. In all probability, suffered a head injury during birth. So,
objection, Your Honor.
You know, he might have started losing their interest a little bit. But then they got to the officers Archer and McMillan, which they were very upset about the res gestae. So, and he made a point of that the officers that were actually handcuffed to Oswald when he shot didn't hear all these things that Jack Ruby has said. So he said, there are peace officers and there are peace officers, but you'll find that these youngsters are the ones who will supply the district attorney with the so-called res gestae statements. You don't find that in men like Graves. He was right on top of it. They've got to stand or fall in this lawsuit with the McMillan boys' testimony. They've got to stand or fall, and McMillan lied through his teeth. He must have said that about 20 times. Now, they really got involved in that, and he got so worked up. And I'm going to do this before my career is out, I think.
Okay.
And I hope the defense attorneys here will try it.
I have no idea.
Because
go ahead.
When he got wound up about the McMillan boy, finally Henry Wade objected, and he wheeled and ran over to Henry Wade and said, in response to the objection, "Boy, they're hurting now, aren't they, Judge? I'm hurting them now." So I want to do that.
Yeah. I'll tell you what.
At some point, to have the guts to yell out.
I think any of the lawyers that are in my court, you can do that one time.
Okay, one time.
I'll let you do it once.
Whew. So
hurting them now.
And he would continue the little needling of Wade. He said, Jack likes to do favors for his friends, like his friend Henry Wade. And, that would get the DAs up. And Jim Bowie objected, said, there's no evidence he's done any favors for Henry Wade. And Mr. Wade got in on it. Judge, I've nodded to some 100,000 people in my life that I didn't know. And then Tonhill said, well, you've had a lot of good luck, Hank. I voted for you, which was hard because he lived in Jasper, Texas. But, he played around with the facts. And, he said, Jack Ruby going around identifying people like Henry Wade. Somehow it embarrasses Henry Wade that he knows Jack Ruby now. And, again, that would cause more objections. But he saved his most vicious comments for Bill Alexander. Remember, Bill Alexander had needled him pretty good. And so he finally turned and said, Bill Alexander likes to travel. He would like to see the rolling hills and bluebonnets and dogwoods and tall pines all over East Texas on his way to Huntsville to watch the execution. He'd watch it and he would love it. Have you watched his eyes, his tarantula-like eyes, and seen what terrific pleasure he would derive if you gave Jack Ruby the death penalty? Tarantula-like eyes.
Tarantula-like eyes.
And I'm sure Bill Alexander was just grinning back at him. He did.
I was.
So finally, after an hour and 6 minutes, the Judge Brown said, wrap it up, Mr. Tonhill. And so he did it in a unique way, which I don't think I'll use.
No, I don't think it would be good.
He stepped to the jury panel and said, I just want a minute to look at you. And he did that. He waited 1 minute and stared at them all. And then he sat down. And then he gave his...
it would be great if we could go on field and see what the lawyers were thinking here in the middle of this trial like they do on the football games. Let's go to... What happened to the video? Oh. There we go.
We're dealing with a very rare disease in this psychomotor variant epilepsy. And it's not easy to explain, not easy to understand. But we do have an intelligent jury. One that will not be swayed by emotion, and that's one thing I did not indulge in, like you generally do in some personal injury cases over in the East Woods. You do get a little emotional, and I didn't get emotional.
I was going to remark that that was purposeful. You did not intend, in other words, to have an emotional direct appeal to the jury.
Absolutely not. Anything but an emotional appeal to this jury. This jury is too sophisticated and too intelligent to tolerate emotional appeals.
There you go. I don't know. It seemed pretty emotional to me, especially when Toby does it. I think it's great. Jim Bowie was up next, and he is the third to last before Mr. Belli and before Mr. Wade. And he was hitting on the same themes that we go through with these others for the state, that there's something more important to you. There's something more important than me. There's something more important than Jack Ruby, and that is the law. We ask that you write a verdict that will deter others from doing what he did. The law against murder is no stronger than the weakest heart that sits on this jury. I ask that you write a verdict that will show the state, the county, this land, and this world that we do not allow murder to occur here of a shackled man. And with that, we go to, there's Mr. Bowie, we go to Mr. Belli.
Now, Melvin Belli had this melodious voice. He was a great speaker, and so, you know, it's a hush courtroom because he's got to pull it out. And he started out his argument very well. He said, when he thanked everyone, as every lawyer did, he started in and said, and it's about what?
When he went up about midnight.
Yeah, just after midnight. So he said, let it now in the beginning of the small hours of the morning when great discoveries in the history of the world have been made in garrets and attics and basements, in here, in the temple of justice, we can't rediscover something that was never lost in your great city of Dallas, that we may rediscover justice. Now, that's a great way to start out a closing argument.
Where did he go from here?
Well, he followed that up with, and remember we told you that he has a healthy ego. My life has been dedicated to the law, perhaps except for the months Howard Nafziger wanted me to leave the law and go to especially brain surgery. Other than those few months, I think I've dedicated my whole life to the discipline and study of law. So he veered off to say that he could have been a brain surgeon if he wanted, but the law was blessed to have him back. And you can imagine, I think that got him off a little at track. But he got into what basically he wanted to do is said, it was hard to follow with reading it, but he said there's three categories. There's the unstable man who that weekend in Dallas, the stable man who that weekend in Dallas, with all the emotion, sees Oswald and shoots him. Well, that's the kind of guy you can find guilty, but give him a suspended sentence. Then the second category is the unstable man, kind of like the man who, and he gave the example, runs off the field and tackles. Unstable man with a little bit of family history, who then shoots Lee Harvey Oswald under these same circumstances. And that's a guy who you definitely have to give a suspended sentence to. And then there's the person like Jack, who had a family history, who was unstable, and had psychomotor epilepsy. That man's insane. And he never once asked about finding mercy. He didn't spend any time, hey, give him life sentence, give him just some prison time. Not one mention of lesser included offense. He wanted the all or nothing all the way, and fought that way all the way to the end.
Well, Mr. Belli, the communists would be happy to know that you could commit murder of a handcuffed man in police custody and walk out a free man. I don't think you're interested in that, ladies and gentlemen. To turn this man loose, you would set civilization back a century. You'd set it back to barbarianism. You would set it back to lynch law and say that anybody that I have decided should be killed, I can kill. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to show Jack Ruby the same mercy and the same compassion and the same sympathy that he showed to Lee Harvey Oswald in your police department and in your county. That was Henry Wade's response to Mr. Belli, taking it back to the themes that we have here. So Saturday, the jurors go home, and they decide they were going to come back on Saturday morning. And of course, this was a Saturday morning, March 14th, 1964. It's a really good picture there, setting the stage for Mr. Kennedy, photographer of the Star-Telegram. That's Old Red. And we have the verdict being read. I believe this is the first time. This is obviously the first killing on live TV.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have reached a verdict in this case. May I have it, Sheriff, please?
There is the verdict. O'Mabra handing it to the judge.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder with malice as charged in the indictment and assess his punishment at death. Signed, Max E. Causey, Foreman. So say you all, ladies and gentlemen. Is that your unanimous verdict? Will all of you whose verdict that is, please hold up your right hands. All right, Sheriff, he's your first.
All right, so that's the verdict, and I've cut this part out because this is the picture that I was referring to before. This was a rant that was legendary. It started right about the time the verdict was read, and Belli followed it, and you're going to see a little bit of that here in two of these clips that we have. This is kind of hard to hear on the audio, but the words are pretty succinct. May I thank this jury for a victory for bigotry and injustice. American justice has been raped, outraged in shouting and in tears. I was its spokesman there. And that's what he shouted as the jurors had read their verdict and the judge read the verdict. So let's hear from Mr. Belli and Mr. Tannehill. This is just outside the courtroom, actually probably inside the courtroom.
How do you feel about Judge Brown? How do you think he handled the case? Mr. Belli, your opinion on Judge Brown?
He went down the line for every motion that the district attorney made, and they led him into some 30 errors. And every Texas jurist knows this thing was the greatest railroading kangaroo court disgrace in the history of American law.
Did you say that they disregarded your entire psychiatric case?
They disregard every bit of our psychiatric testimony. They disregarded every witness who was sworn. And you heard last night when those jurors looked at us and said, we don't want to have any argument. We've had our mind made up. Now, that was the nod when the judge said, do you want to go ahead? They didn't even want recess. Why, in a civilized country in the heart of darkest Africa, you wouldn't argue a man's life starting at 12 o'clock in the morning. When I think we're coming into Holy Week and Good Friday to have a sacrifice like this, I think we're back 2,000 years. And the blight that's on Dallas with those 12 people who announced a death penalty in this case, they'll make this a city of shame forevermore. And I'm going to participate in it, too, when I write this appeal.
Mr. Belli, Mr. Tannehill, your associate is a Texan. What's your reaction to it?
It's a violent miscarriage of justice.
Well, what did Jack say after the verdict?
Anything else to add to that, Mr. Tannehill?
I'm about to throw up.
Now that's great. For Henry Wade, this was an extraordinary victory. It's a good picture of him out there in the front steps of the criminal courts.
District Attorney Henry Wade on the steps of the Dallas County Criminal Courts building, where death in the electric chair has just been assessed as punishment for Jack Ruby for the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald.
What's your reaction, Mr. Wade?
Well, from the start, when this happened, I thought it was a case where he should have the death penalty. I've said that all along, told the jury that. We asked
Henry Wade, the district attorney.
And we asked for it. I think the facts fully warranted. I think it was an assassination in itself of a man handcuffed in police custody, and I think it went actually deeper than that, than who the person was killed. I think it was more of a you might say a murder or killing of our government by law rather than men. I think it actually is a step. It even advances civilization quite a bit, I believe, by this verdict. That's my theory.
All right. Just a quick special thanks to some of the folks that I talked to. There's Tammy True dancing at the actual Carousel Club. That's the wood carving of the Carousel Club. This was Hugh Ainsworth, the man on the right. I talked with him quite a bit. He was one of the ones who revealed to us how Mr. Oswald was able to escape and get through to that. There's, of course, Mr. Lavelle. Thank you very much for coming and talking to me about your experiences in this process. This is the time, I guess, for questions and comments, although I really feel like we've gone over quite a bit. I'll take direction from Nicola. We're good? That's it? Very, very good. All right. Thank you all very much for coming.